Well, our next conversation is not so much about the National Assembly in itself, really, but it's about a document that has been considered on the floor of the National Assembly. That's the Finance Bill 2020. You're wondering, how does that concern you? Well, let's find out. And we have joining us this morning Mr. Kola, Ayeye, who's an economist and CEO of GDL Asset Management Limited, joins us in our Lagos studio. Beautiful morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
So the finance bill, really, to a lot of people, different things. Some don't even really know what it is, really. They just move on with life. But to you, what is this finance bill 2020 in particular?
Okay, essentially, looking at the finance bill, it's government's effort to finance itself. The things contained in the bill are the efforts of government to plug the holes in the budget and finance itself. So that's what government is seeking to do. And the thing to bear in mind, as they say, is if it's not broke, don't fix it. So when government comes up with a bill that is changing the structure and the process with which it wants to raise money and finance the budget, it means there is either a problem that they're trying to solve, or there are gaps that they have seen in process that they want to improve, or there are areas in the economy they want to encourage.
Quick comparison, if you don't mind, Mr. Ayeye. The first finance bill, first of its kind, was 2019,
Yes.
no, 2020.
Yes.
And then this one
was 2019.
2019,
Yeah.
okay. Now, what's the difference? What are the differences or similarities you can place? Here, you're saying that this finance bill being proposed is government's effort to finance itself.
Yes.
The previous one, many people applauded it as an attempt by government to stimulate the small and medium enterprises. Do you see that continuing in this new one?
You'll permit me to be frank. You know, the government we have is fiscally irresponsible. We're pushing ourselves to a fiscally unsustainable bind. And what hasn't been done is acknowledging that there are problems which are not sustainable and then deciding on how to plug it. You see, what the fiscal bill 2020 does compared to what comes before it is that it reveals that government sees that it is incurring unsustainable deficits and that it needs to find ways to plug the hole. Now, the question that hasn't been asked is, what got you to that point? If you are in trouble because you are not making enough revenue, then the problem is to plug revenue. But if a major part of your problem is because of unsustainable and inefficient expenditure, you don't go out trying to collect money from everybody simply because you have the power to, when expenditure is irresponsible. And this is how I feel.
What are these expenditures that you can cite?
Okay, for example, let's look at government at all levels. What has happened for the federal government from 2017, to date, is they have ambitious revenue targets which they never meet. Revenue performance compared to budget is usually less than 60%. They have debt service expenditure and recurrent expenditure. They always meet debt service expenditure almost 100%, between 100 and 110%.
You don't want to be a bad debtor.
Because debt service is there.
Yeah.
And recurrent expenditure has sometimes been between 150 to 200%. So government meets its targets on spending money, and it does not meet its target on raising revenues. And the problem is that government expenditure is wasteful. It is significantly inefficient. I mean, a popular whipping boy, of everybody. I saw one of the legislators saying what we budget for the National Assembly is not more than 1% of the entire budget. It shows the way people think. This is a club of less than 500 people. 1% of our budget is 100. I mean, this is what somebody said on here. Then let me give you some other examples why people should worry. All of us, I'm sitting in your Lagos studio. So just to come down to Lagos, let me say one more thing about federal government, which was in the news recently. It's small, but it's indicative. A minister said we need 80 million to cut grass in the National Assembly. This was in the papers a week or two ago. You see, in the last year, over 800 billion was voted for the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs to cater for the problems. And with respect, in the course of the last crisis, we saw what a group of young people achieved with 60 million. What have we done with 800 billion? And let me say the other thing. For a number of years, because of insurgency, our defense budgets are huge. In fact, the defense budget for this year is over 700 billion. Why are we spending money on defense every year and the insurgency persists? And we're going on as if we're not allowed to ask questions. You cannot continue spending money inefficiently and then you desperately start asking for money from everybody. This budget, this fiscal bill, two of the ways he wants to raise money is that he's seeking for government to confiscate all dividends which are unclaimed and all balances in bank accounts which are dormant, defined as monies that are dormant for 6 years. What gives government the right? What makes government a better manager of dormant balances than the banks? When I get to Dubai and I see the signpost of some of the Nigerian banks, it makes me feel proud as a Nigerian. When I go into government departments, I don't feel that way. How has government conducted itself that makes it feel it's a better manager of money that has been left dormant? Why is government a better manager of unclaimed dividends than the companies that own those dividends?
What is wrong with that in itself?
Listen, you see, one of the things we need to come to is that we all have a stake in the country. That's the first thing we need to understand. And then in the country, there are different economic agents. Are you getting me?
Yeah.
So you see, government is an economic agent. Private sector players, companies, are economic agents. Households are economic agents. You look in the course of where you are at and say, in our own peculiarities, who is currently the more efficient manager and administrator of resources? If government is an efficient one, what you do is you get it more efficient. You don't take resources from a more efficient manager and put it in the hands of a less efficient manager. You see, the philosophy of our tax policy is to get money for. That's not the purpose of tax policy. The purpose of tax policy should be to direct resources to the hands of the best manager.
And in this case, not the government.
In Nigeria's case, clearly not. Obviously not.
We referenced the 2019 finance bill, and this is just to weigh the options. I mean, weigh what happened. So for the 2019 finance bill, would you say it was effective in raising money for the government, such that we can now say, well, this 2020 bill would even do much better?
Well, we've not... My suspicion is that based on what has happened, some of the crises that we've had this year, we may actually have a situation where the government budget deficit may go completely out of whack. So, you see, let me put it this way. You can't keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. We were told that, on some of the things that are very painful, is that in 2015, the expectations we had for this government was transparency, efficiency, and improvement in quality of government spend. That hasn't happened. The presidential fleet remains as large as it substantially remains as large as it was. We cannot see that government ministries and government departments and government agencies have made significant improvements in the way that they spend money. See, the country is in a fiscal bind. You know what ought to be done? The 2020 fiscal responsibility bill ought to be a desperate attempt to cut expenditure.
So some of those provisions you're seeing are not the ones you expected to see.
No.
So clearly you are saying that this is not about raising money. Really.
Yes.
It's about how we spend the money which we have.
Precisely.
But, you know, you've talked about the National Assembly, you've talked about the executive, and, you know, the arguments that usually come up is some of these things pay salaries. I mean, therefore, overhead costs. They are directly at people who otherwise will be unemployed. So how do you balance that argument? I know you've talked about the 500 legislators, I mean, and 1%, that doesn't quite make sense. But how do you balance the argument that this pays salaries of people?
Okay, let me give you one, and I like to be fair. Let me give you something that is reasonable that government has done. Government says government must pay labor. Government is a large employer of labor. So, for example, one of the few things this government got right is saying that we are going to make payroll payments electronic. So we eliminate ghost workers. Do you understand? You know, for example, this year, government workers were probably not at work for 4 to 5 months in the year. I'm waiting for the expenditure on overheads at the end of the year that will not show savings. Because it's people in the office that should drive expenditure. So, you know, what should happen, you know, where we are at is that on this Fiscal Responsibility Act, fundamentally, one thing we got wrong is that the advanced countries, when they're planning fiscal responsibility, they relate deficit to the size of the GDP. And that's what we've done. You see, in those countries, the informal sector is small. So automatically, when GDP grows, government revenue grows. Because everybody is formal and is in the net. We have a huge informal sector that is also poor. And revenue, GDP growth for us does not mean growth in government revenue. So the first thing we should have done with the fiscal responsibility is to say that we are going to start relating deficit to government revenue, not GDP. And start to say to ourselves that we must go and ensure we spend money, you know, judiciously. There was a point in this country, I'm not even sure we were this broke. Things just looked like they would get a little hard, and we had low profile. Do you know the things we've gotten used to? Do you see the kind of cars that government buys? Mr. Ayeye, do you see the kind of convoys that government officials running?
My apologies. There is a reference that you have made, which for me is, you know, is of significant importance. If we're going to, as you said, get out of this fiscal bind that we seem to find ourselves. For most developing nations, the micro, small, and medium enterprise sector is usually huge. Something in the region of 60 to 70% of the economy is usually made of that. How significant is this fiscal bill, this finance bill of government, this one that we are looking at now, how significant is it to help that sector grow so that the economy can benefit from it?
You know one thing, you see, it's not only important for the SMEs to be large, their quality is also important. You see, the quality of MSMEs that we have in Nigeria is rudimentary. A lot of them are micro enterprises. Micro enterprises don't transform economies. Micro enterprises put the entrepreneurs on survival stipends. You see, economic growth is cohesive and collaborative. You need the very large companies, as you need the medium and the small scale. You know what happens in economies that work? The very large companies provide first-class quality markets
for the small
and medium scale enterprises.
Now, in this wise, now looking at this bill,
yes,
how does it help these big companies that you're talking about now?
Let me go to how it seeks to even help the small companies. You see, it helps them in theory, but in practice, it doesn't. The major provision of this act, when it relates to small companies, it says if you are between 20 and 100 million in turnover, you are small and you're exempted from tax. You know what it hasn't told us? How much tax did those companies pay before?
When you calculate company income tax, withholding tax, value-added tax, okay, there's exemption from that one. There's the NSITF tax. There's so many other education tax and so many others like that.
Forgive me.
Because I actually had a conversation with someone who said that, you know, they have a significant, was a public forum that there's quite a chunk of money that goes from the MSMEs into
now, maybe I've not read the act well. When I read this act, what I got, and this is just underscoring what you're saying, the impression I got was that this was not intended to withhold, to exempt them from things like VAT or withholding tax. It was to exempt them from companies' income tax. The 30% or 20% which they pay. They rarely ever paid it. So the targeting is weak. You see, if there's something I wasn't paying, and you now come and say stop paying it, it looks good on paper. In practice, you've not changed my my position. And please let me say something, and I don't want to sound alarmist. You see, this act says two things. It says, Ayeye, if you leave your money in a bank account for 6 years and you don't spend it, government will create an organ from the DMO that will take it and manage it. No, I want you to take that one. And you know the second thing? It also says dividends for 6 years, it will take it. Do you know the second thing it says? It says all of us will pay a 50 naira tax on all electronic transactions.
So here's what we'll do. We'll take a look at those provisions now closely, but we need to go on a break. We're due for a break. So when we return, we'll take a look at these provisions and show you what they say and what that might mean to your business in a moment. Please stay with us. You're welcome back. Now, Mr. Ayeye, there are a few provisions, really. Well, quite a number of provisions in the Finance Bill 2020. And just to put it on record that this is still going through the legislative process, some of these provisions might not eventually be in the Act.
That's right.
We might see some additions, but basically we're looking at what we have as a draft Finance Bill. So we talked about the creation of that unclaimed dividend trust fund and, of course, for dormant accounts, which a lot of people have kicked against, including you. There's also the electronic money transfer levy that imposes a levy to be referred to as electronic money transfer on electronic receipts or electronic transfer for money deposited in any DMB. And it says that that levy shall be a one-off charge of 50 naira on electronic receipts. But there's also this one about state-owned corporations. You think that's a big game changer, isn't it?
Well, it ought to be. You see, what I'm saying about government efficiency, what government has done with this act is that it says state-owned enterprises should limit the ratio of their costs to revenues to a maximum of 50%. Then it says your surplus, you must put 20% of it in reserves and remit. The simple arithmetic of that is government is saying every state-owned enterprise must remit a minimum of 10% of its revenues. You know, we are broke. And before extracting money from all of us who are struggling, this talk about state-owned enterprises, why isn't it more rigorous and more transparent? So why don't we sit down so that we all know how much does MPA earn? How much is it supposed to earn? How much does it spend? How much should it spend? How much does NIMASA earn? How much does it spend? And how much should it spend? How much then NDDC? You know, there are some government and there's some state-owned enterprises. Central Bank. What is the expenditure of Central Bank? Some people have said that some of these state-owned enterprises, you aggregate their expenditure and it's even more or as much as the federal government budget. So what I'm saying is, when we're in this bind, why do we just throw a ratio that says you can't spend more than 50% of your revenue? Why don't we start here and drill down? There may be some enterprises that need to spend 70, but there's some that may not need to spend more than 20.
So you'd rather some sort of specificity?
A process that now insists on rigor, that says that we look at your budget from bottom up. In fact, we get external parties that do value for money audit. You know, the way we budget now is that we spent X last year and we're going to spend X plus this year. So why don't we look at it from base zero? So you see, for these state-owned enterprises, CBN, NIMASA, NPA, NDDC, you see, the huge AMCON, the huge state government-owned enterprises, when we're in this bind, we ought to find out how much can these guys really contribute if they are rigorous and efficient. So I'm saying this falls far short. This is This is a first step, but a first step that does not go nearly enough in a financially desperate situation.
So you think that there's probably some form of, pardon me, some fiscal irresponsibility going on in some of these state-owned enterprises?
Essentially, till date, it has been said that the management of the finances of state-owned enterprises ought to be much more transparent so that their contribution to the central treasury is at optimal level. It clearly isn't.
To a large extent, Mr. Ayeye, this conversation, of course, the finance bill, has been a lot more about the federal government's responsibilities and hasn't said anything significant about the role and contributions of state governments in all of these. One wonders, because if the state governments they are closer to the people, they are closer to be able to offer them the dividends of democracy, as we say, and be more productive for them. Isn't there a way that this finance bill should address some responsibilities that state governments themselves should take so that the challenges of the people can be ameliorated a little?
That was one of the first big mistakes of this government. That was their first act of huge fiscal irresponsibility. You see, there is separation of powers. So the federal government can't dictate to the states. But you know what happens? When states are broke and they need bailout, that is the right time to insist that states adopt certain practices and domesticate it and legislate it in the assemblies before the federal government bails them out. You know what we saw in this government? Oil price crashed in 2015. Many states were desperate. This government just kept giving them handouts. That was the time to tell them, listen, we will help the states that do A, B, C, D, E.
I think there were some terms and conditions, maybe not as extensive as you would want, but there were indeed some terms and conditions.
I think those, let me tell you the kind of terms and conditions you need. If you notice what even some of them who have been politicians say, they say when it's time to save, when oil prices are up, and the federal government says we must save, states kick. You know what you do? You tell them to make laws.
Well, you can't. No. You can't dictate.
But you know what I can dictate to? It's not state-federal government relationship. It is lender-borrower relationship. It says to the governor, you want a bailout? I'm not asking you to give me money. I'm saying go and make a law in your state that says that when oil price gets to this level, when the federal government seeks X, we also save Y for ourselves. You're not saving it for the federal government. And you're saying to them, if you think I want to control you, it's not a problem. Go and sort out your problem.
Clearly the public hearing for this bill will be quite an interesting one. And it'll be good to see you there anyway. But we'd like to thank you so much, Mr. Kola. Thank you, economist and CEO, GDL Asset Management Limited. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us on the program.
Thank you.